Section 29 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Gerard. Part 5, Chapter 6. Sobered by Catherine's blows, Étienne had remained at the head of his mates. But while he was hoarsely urging them on to Montsou, he heard another voice within him, the voice of reason, asking, in astonishment, the meaning of all this. He had not intended any of these things. How had it happened that, having set out for Jean Bart with the object of acting calmly and preventing disaster, he had finished this day of increasing violence by besieging the manager's villa? He it certainly was, however, who had just cried "Halt!" Only at first his sole idea had been to protect the Company's yards, which there had been talk of sacking. And now that stones were already grazing the façade of the villa, he sought in vain for some lawful prey on which to throw the band, so as to avoid greater misfortunes. As he thus stood alone, powerless, in the middle of the road, he was called by a man standing on the threshold of the Estaminet des Sons, where the landlady had just put up the shutters in haste, leaving only the door free. "Yes, it's me. Will you listen?" It was Rasseneur. Some 30 men and women, nearly all belonging to the settlement of the Deux Cent Quarante, who had remained at home in the morning and had come in the evening for news, had invaded this estaminet on the approach of the strikers. Zacharie occupied a table with his wife, Philomène. Farther on, Pierron and Pierronne, with their backs turned, were hiding their faces. No one was drinking; they had simply taken shelter. Étienne recognized Rasseneur and was turning away, when the latter added: "You don't want to see me, eh? I warned you things are getting awkward. Now you may ask for bread. They'll give you lead." Then Étienne came back and replied: "What troubles me is, the cowards who fold their arms and watch us, risking our skins." "Your notion, then, is to pillage over there?" asked Rasseneur. "My notion is to remain to the last with our friends, quit by dying together." In despair, Étienne went back into the crowd, ready to die. On the road 3 children were throwing stones, and he gave them a good kick, shouting out to his comrades that it was no good breaking windows. Bébert and Lydie, who had rejoined Jeanlin, were learning from him how to work the sling. They each set a flint, playing at who could do the most damage. Lydie had awkwardly cracked the head of a woman in the crowd, and the 2 boys were loudly laughing. Bonnemort and Mouque, seated on a bench, were gazing at them behind. Bonnemort's swollen legs bore him so badly that he had great difficulty in dragging himself so far. No one knew what curiosity impelled him, for his face had the earthy look of those days when he never spoke a word. Nobody, however, any longer obeyed Étienne. The stones, in spite of his orders, went on hailing, and he was astonished and terrified by these brutes he had unmuzzled, who were so slow to move and then so terrible, so ferociously tenacious in their rage. All the old Flemish blood was there, heavy and placid, taking months to get heated, and then giving itself up to abominable savagery, listening to nothing until the beast was glutted by atrocities. In his southern land crowds flamed up more quickly, but they did not effect so much. He had to struggle with Levaque to obtain possession of his axe, and he knew not how to keep back the Maheus, who were throwing flints with both hands. The women especially terrified him. The Levaque, Mouquette, and the others, who were agitated by murderous fury, with teeth and nails out, barking like bitches, and driven on by Mother Brulé, whose lean figure dominated them. But there was a sudden stop. A moment's surprise brought a little of that calmness which Étienne's supplications could not obtain. It was simply the Grégoires, who had decided to bid farewell to the lawyer and to cross the road to the manager's house, and they seemed so peaceful, they so clearly had the air of believing that the whole thing was a joke on the part of their worthy miners, whose resignation had nourished them for a century, that the latter, in fact, left off throwing stones, for fear of hitting this old gentleman and old lady who had fallen from the sky. They allowed them to enter the garden, mount the steps, and ring at the barricaded door, which was by no means opened in a hurry. Just then, Rose, the housemaid, was returning, laughing at the furious workmen, all of whom she knew, for she belonged to Montsou. And it was she who, by striking her fists against the door, at last forced Hippolyte to set it ajar. It was time, for as the Grégoires disappeared, the hail of stones began again. Recovering from its astonishment, the crowd was shouting louder than ever: "Death to the bourgeois! Hurrah for the people!" Rose went on laughing in the hall of the villa, as though amused by the adventure, and repeated to the terrified manservant: "They're not bad hearted, I know them." Monsieur Grégoire methodically hung up his hat. Then, when he had assisted Madame Grégoire to draw off her thick cloth mantle, he said in his turn: "Certainly, they have no malice at bottom. When they have shouted well they will go home to supper with more appetite." At this moment M. Hennebeau came down from the second floor. He had seen the scene, and came to receive his guests in his usual cold and polite manner. The pallor of his face alone revealed the grief which had shaken him. The man was tamed. There only remained in him the correct administrator resolved to do his duty. "You know," he said, "the ladies have not yet come back." For the first time some anxiety disturbed the Grégoires. Cécile not come back! How could she come back now if the miners were to prolong their joking? "I thought of having the place cleared," added M. Hennebeau. "But the misfortune is that I'm alone here, and besides, I do not know where to send my servant to bring me 4 men and a corporal to clear away this mob." Rose, who had remained there, ventured to murmur anew: "Oh, sir, they are not bad hearted." The manager shook his head, while the tumult increased outside, and they could hear the dull crash of the stones against the house. "I don't wish to be hard on them. I can even excuse them. One must be as foolish as they are to believe that we are anxious to injure them. But it is my duty to prevent disturbance. To think that there are police all along the roads, as I am told, and that I have not been able to see a single man since the morning!" He interrupted himself, and drew back before Madame Grégoire, saying: "Let me beg you, madame, do not stay here. Come into the drawing room." But the cook, coming up from below in exasperation, kept them in the hall a few minutes longer. She declared that she could no longer accept any responsibility for the dinner, for she was expecting from the Marchiennes pastry cook some vol au vent crusts, which she had ordered for 4 o'clock. The pastry cook had evidently turned aside on the road for fear of these bandits. Perhaps they had even pillaged his hampers. She saw the vol au vent blockaded behind a bush, besieged, going to swell the bellies of the 3,000 wretches who were asking for bread. In any case, Monsieur was warned, she would rather pitch her dinner into the fire if it was to be spoilt because of the revolt. "Patience, patience," said M. Hennebeau. "All is not lost. The pastry cook may come." And as he turned toward Madame Grégoire, opening the drawing room door himself, he was much surprised to observe, seated on the hall bench, a man whom he had not distinguished before in the deepening shade. "What! You, Maigrat? What is it, then?" Maigrat arose. His fat, pale face was changed by terror. He no longer possessed his usual calm stolidity. He humbly explained that he had slipped into the manager's house to ask for aid and protection should the brigands attack his shop. "You see that I am threatened myself, and that I have no one," replied M. Hennebeau. "You would have done better to stay at home and guard your property." "Oh, I have put up iron bars and left my wife there." The manager showed impatience, and did not conceal his contempt. A fine guard, that poor creature worn out by blows. "Well, I can do nothing. You must try to defend yourself. I advise you to go back at once, for there they are again, demanding bread. Listen!" In fact, the tumult began again, and Maigrat thought he heard his own name in the midst of the cries. To go back was no longer possible; they would have torn him to pieces. Besides, the idea of his ruin overcame him. He pressed his face to the glass panel of the door, perspiring and trembling in anticipation of disaster, while the Grégoires decided to go into the drawing room. M. Hennebeau quietly endeavoured to do the honours of his house. But in vain he begged his guests to sit down. The close, barricaded room, lighted by two lamps in the daytime, was filled with terror at each new clamour from without. Amid the stuffy hangings, the fury of the mob rolled more disturbingly, with vague and terrible menace. They talked, however, constantly brought back to this inconceivable revolt. He was astonished at having foreseen nothing, and his information was so defective that he specially talked against Rasseneur, whose detestable influence, he said, he was able to recognize. Besides, the gendarmes would come; it was impossible that he should be thus abandoned. As to the Grégoires, they only thought about their daughter, the poor darling, who was so quickly frightened. Perhaps, in face of the peril, the carriage had returned to Marchiennes. They waited on for another quarter of an hour, worn out by the noise in the street, and by the sound of the stones from time to time striking the closed shutters, which rang out like gongs. The situation was no longer bearable. M. Hennebeau spoke of going out to chase away the brawlers by himself, and to meet the carriage, when Hippolyte appeared, exclaiming: "Sir, sir, here is madame! They are killing madame!" The carriage had not been able to pass through the threatening groups in the Réquillart lane. Négrel had carried out his idea, walking the 100 metres which separated them from the house, and knocking at the little door which led to the garden near the common. The gardener would hear them, for there was always someone there to open. And at first things had gone perfectly. Madame Hennebeau and the young ladies were already knocking, when some women, who had been warned, rushed into the lane. Then everything was spoilt. The door was not opened, and Négrel in vain sought to burst it open with his shoulder. The rush of women increased, and fearing they would be carried away, he adopted the desperate method of pushing his aunt and the girls before him, in order to reach the front steps, by passing through the besiegers. But this manoeuvre led to a hustling. They were not left free. A shouting band followed them, while the crowd floated up to right and to left, without understanding, simply astonished at these dressed up ladies lost in the midst of the battle. At this moment the confusion was so great that it led to one of those curious mistakes which can never be explained. Lucie and Jeanne reached the steps and slipped in through the door, which the housemaid opened. Madame Hennebeau had succeeded in following them, and behind them Négrel at last came in, and then bolted the door, feeling sure that he had seen Cécile go in first. She was no longer there, having disappeared on the way, so carried away by fear that she had turned her back to the house, and had moved of her own accord into the thick of danger. At once the cry arose: "Hurrah for the people! Death to the bourgeois! To death with them!" A few of those in the distance, beneath the veil which hid her face, mistook her for Madame Hennebeau. Others said she was a friend of the manager's wife, the young wife of a neighbouring manufacturer, who was execrated by his men. And besides, it mattered little; it was her silk dress, her fur mantle, even the white feather in her hat, which exasperated them. She smelled of perfume, she wore a watch, she had the delicate skin of a lazy woman who had never touched coal. "Stop!" shouted Mother Brulé. "We'll put it on your arse, that lace!" "The lazy sluts steal it from us," said the Levaque. "They stick fur onto their skins while we are dying of cold. Just strip her naked to show her how to live." At once Mouquette rushed forward. "Yes, yes, whip her!" And the women, in this savage rivalry, struggled and stretched out their rags, as though each were trying to get a morsel of this rich girl. No doubt her backside was not better made than any one else's. More than one of them were rotten beneath their gewgaws. This injustice had lasted quite long enough; they should be forced to dress themselves like workwomen, these harlots who dared to spend 50 sous on the washing of a single petticoat. In the midst of these furies Cécile was shaking with paralyzed legs, stammering over and over again the same phrase: "Ladies, please, please! Ladies, please don't hurt me!" But she suddenly uttered a shrill cry. Cold hands had seized her by the neck. The rush had brought her near old Bonnemort, who had taken hold of her. He seemed drunk from hunger, stupefied by his long misery, suddenly arousing himself from the resignation of half a century, under the influence of no one knew what malicious impulse. After having in the course of his life saved a dozen mates from death, risking his bones in fire damps and landslips, he was yielding to things which he would not have been able to express, compelled to do thus, fascinated by this young girl's white neck. And as on this day he had lost his tongue, he clenched his fingers, with his air of an old infirm animal ruminating over his recollections. "No, no!" yelled the women. "Uncover her arse! Out with her arse!" In the villa, as soon as they had realized the mishap, Négrel and M. Hennebeau bravely reopened the door to run to Cécile's help. But the crowd was now pressing against the garden railings, and it was not easy to go out. A struggle took place here, while the Grégoires in terror stood on the steps. "Let her be, then, old man! It's the Piolaine young lady!" cried Maheude to the grandfather, recognizing Cécile, whose veil had been torn off by one of the women. On his side, Étienne, overwhelmed at this retaliation on a child, was trying to force the band to let go their prey. An inspiration came to him. He brandished the axe, which he had snatched from Levaque's hands. "To Maigrat's house! By God, there's bread in there! Down to the earth with Maigrat's damned shed!" And at random he gave the first blow of the axe against the shop door. Some comrades had followed him, Levaque, Maheu, and a few others. But the women were furious, and Cécile had fallen from Bonnemort's fingers into Mother Brulé's hands. Lydie and Bébert, led by Jeanlin, had slipped on all fours between her petticoats to see the lady's bottom. Already the women were pulling her about, her clothes were beginning to split, when a man on horseback appeared, pushing on his animal, and using his riding whip on those who would not stand back quick enough. "Ah, rascals! You are going to flog our daughters, are you?" It was Deneulin, who had come to the rendezvous for dinner. He quickly jumped on to the road, took Cécile by the waist, and, with the other hand manipulating his horse with remarkable skill and strength, he used it as a living wedge to split the crowd, which drew back before the onset. At the railing the battle continued. He passed through, however, with some bruises. This unforeseen assistance delivered Négrel and M. Hennebeau, who were in great danger amid the oaths and blows. And while the young man at last led in the fainting Cécile, Deneulin protected the manager with his tall body, and at the top of the steps received a stone which nearly put his shoulder out. "That's it!" he cried. "Break my bones now you've broken my engines." He promptly pushed the door to, and a volley of flints fell against it. "What madmen!" he exclaimed. "2 seconds more and they would have broken my skull like an empty gourd. There is nothing to say to them. What could you do? They know nothing. You could only knock them down." In the drawing room the Grégoires were weeping as they watched Cécile recover. She was not hurt, there was not even a scratch to be seen, only her veil was lost. But their fright increased when they saw before them their cook, Mélanie, who described how the mob had demolished Piolaine. Mad with fear, she had run to warn her masters. She had come in when the door was ajar at the moment of the fray, without anyone noticing her, and in her endless narrative the single stone with which Jeanlin had broken one window pane became a regular cannonade which had crushed through the walls. Then M. Grégoire's ideas were altogether upset. They were murdering his daughter, they were razing his house to the ground. It was, then, true that these miners could bear him ill will, because he lived like a worthy man on their labour? The housemaid, who had brought in a towel and some eau de cologne, repeated: "All the same, it's queer. They are not bad-hearted." Madame Hennebeau, seated and very pale, had not recovered from the shock to her feelings, and she was only able to find a smile when Négrel was complimented. Cécile's parents especially thanked the young man, and the marriage might now be regarded as settled. M. Hennebeau looked on in silence, turning from his wife to this lover whom in the morning he had been swearing to kill, then to this young girl by whom he would, no doubt, soon be freed from him. There was no haste, only the fear remained with him of seeing his wife fall lower, perhaps to some lackey. "And you, my little darlings," asked Deneulin of his daughters, "have they broken any of your bones?" Lucie and Jeanne had been much afraid, but they were pleased to have seen it all. They were now laughing. "By George!" the father went on, "we've had a fine day. If you want a dowry, you would do well to earn it yourselves. And you may also expect to have to support me." He was joking, but his voice trembled, his eyes swelled with tears as his two daughters threw themselves into his arms. M. Hennebeau had heard this confession of ruin. A quick thought lit up his face. Vandame would now belong to Montsou. This was the hoped for compensation, the stroke of fortune which would bring him back to favour with the gentlemen on the directorate. At every crisis of his existence he took refuge in the strict execution of the orders he had received. In the military discipline in which he lived he found his small share of happiness. But they grew calm. The drawing room fell back into a weary peacefulness, with the quiet light of its two lamps, and the warm stuffiness of the hangings. What, then, was going on outside? The brawlers were silent, and stones no longer struck the house. One only heard deep, full blows, those blows of the hatchet which one hears in distant woods. They wished to find out, and went back into the hall to venture a glance through the glass panel of the door. Even the ladies went upstairs to post themselves behind the blinds on the first floor. "Do you see that scoundrel, Rasseneur, over there on the threshold of the public house?" said M. Hennebeau to Deneulin. "I had guessed as much. He must be in it." It was not Rasseneur, however; it was Étienne, who was dealing blows from his axe at Maigrat's shop. And he went on calling to the men. Did not the goods in there belong to the colliers? Had they not the right to take back their property from this thief who had exploited them so long, who was starving them at a hint from the Company? Gradually they all left the manager's house, and ran up to pillage the neighbouring shop. The cry, "Bread! Bread! Bread!" broke out anew. They would find bread behind that door. The rage of hunger carried them away, as if they suddenly felt that they could wait no longer without expiring on the road. Such furious thrusts were made at the door that at every stroke of the axe Étienne feared to wound someone. Meanwhile Maigrat, who had left the hall of the manager's house, had at first taken refuge in the kitchen. But, hearing nothing there, he imagined some abominable attempt against his shop, and came up again to hide behind the pump outside, when he distinctly heard the crackling of the door, and shouts of pillage in which his own name was mixed. It was not a nightmare then. If he could not see, he could now hear, and he followed the attack with ringing ears. Every blow struck him in the heart. A hinge must have given way. 5 minutes more and the shop would be taken. The thing was stamped on his brain in real and terrible images, the brigands rushing forward, then the drawers broken open, the sacks emptied, everything eaten, everything drunk, the house itself carried away, nothing left, not even a stick with which he might go and beg through the villages. No, he would never allow them to complete his ruin, he would rather leave his life there. Since he had been here, he noticed at a window of his house his wife's thin silhouette, pale and confused, behind the panes. No doubt she was watching the blows with her usual silent air of a poor beaten creature. Beneath there was a shed, so placed that from the villa garden one could climb it from the palings. Then it was easy to get on to the tiles up to the window. And the idea of thus returning home now pursued him in his remorse at having left. Perhaps he would have time to barricade the shop with furniture. He even invented other and more heroic defences: boiling oil, lighted petroleum, poured out from above. But this love of his property struggled against his fear, and he groaned in the battle with cowardice. Suddenly, on hearing a deeper blow of the axe, he made up his mind. Avarice conquered. He and his wife would cover the sacks with their bodies rather than abandon a single loaf. Almost immediately hooting broke out. "Look! Look! The tom cat's up there! After the cat! After the cat!" The mob had just seen Maigrat on the roof of the shed. In his fever of anxiety he had climbed the palings with agility in spite of his weight, and without troubling over the breaking wood. And now he was flattening himself along the tiles, and endeavouring to reach the window, but the slope was very steep. He was incommoded by his stoutness, and his nails were torn. He would have dragged himself up, however, if he had not begun to tremble with the fear of stones. For the crowd, which he could not see, continued to cry beneath him: "After the cat! After the cat! Do for him!" And suddenly both his hands let go at once, and he rolled down like a ball, leapt at the gutter, and fell across the middle wall in such a way that, by ill chance, he rebounded on the side of the road, where his skull was broken open on the corner of a stone pillar. His brain had spurted out. He was dead. His wife, up above, pale and confused behind the window panes, still looked out. They were stupefied at first. Étienne stopped short, and the axe slipped from his hands. Maheu, Levaque, and the others forgot the shot, with their eyes fixed on the wall along which a thin red streak was slowly flowing down. And the cries ceased, and silence spread over the growing darkness. All at once the hooting began again. It was the women, who rushed forward overcome by the drunkenness of blood. "Then there is a good God after all! Ah, the bloody beast! He's done for!" They surrounded the still warm body. They insulted it with laughter, abusing his fractured head, the dirty chops, hurling in the dead man's face the long venom of their starved lives. "I owed you 60 francs. Now you're paid, thief!" said Maheude, enraged like the others. "You won't refuse me credit any more. Wait, wait, I must fatten you once more." With her finger she scratched up some dirt, took 2 handfuls, and stuffed it violently into his mouth. "There, eat that! There, eat, eat! You used to eat us!" The abuse increased, while the dead man, stretched on his back, gazed motionless with his large fixed eyes at the immense sky from which the night was falling. This earth heaped in his mouth was the bread he had refused to give, and henceforth he would eat of no other bread. It had not brought him luck to starve poor people. But the women had another revenge to wreak on him. They moved round, smelling him like she wolves. They were all seeking for some outrage, some savagery that would relieve them. Mother Brulé's shrill voice was heard: "Cut him like a tom cat!" "Yes, yes, after the cat, after the cat! He's done too much, the dirty beast!" Mouquette was already unfastening and drawing off the trousers, while the Levaque woman raised the legs. And Mother Brulé, with her dry old hands, separated the naked thighs and seized this dead virility. She took hold of everything, tearing with an effort which bent her lean spine and made her long arms crack. The soft skin resisted. She had to try again, and at last carried away the fragment, a lump of hairy and bleeding flesh, which she brandished with a laugh of triumph. "I've got it! I've got it!" Shrill voices saluted with curses the abominable trophy. "Ah, swine! You won't fill our dollars any more." "Yes, we've done with paying on your beastly body. We shan't any more have to offer a backside in return for a loaf." "Here, I owe you 6 francs. Would you like to settle it? I'm quite willing, if you can do it still." This joke shook them all with terrible gaiety. They showed each other the bleeding fragment as an evil beast from which each of them had suffered, and which they had at last crushed, and saw before them, there, inert in their power. They spat on it, they thrust out their jaws, saying over and over again, with furious bursts of contempt: "He can do no more! He can do no more! It's no longer a man that they'll put away in the earth. Go and rot then, good for nothing!" Mother Brulé then planted the whole lump on the end of her stick, and holding it in the air, bore it out like a banner, rushing along the road, followed helter skelter by the yelling troop of women. Drops of blood rained down, and that pitiful flesh hung like a waste piece of meat on a butcher's stall. Up above, at the window, Madame Maigrat still stood motionless, but beneath the last gleams of the setting sun, the confused flaws of the window panes distorted her white face, which looked as though it were laughing. Beaten and deceived at every hour, with shoulders bent from morning to night over a ledger, perhaps she was laughing, while the band of women rushed along with that evil beast, that crushed beast, at the end of the stick. This frightful mutilation was accomplished in frozen horror. Neither Étienne nor Maheu nor the others had had time to interfere. They stood motionless before this gallop of furies. At the door of the Estaminet Tison a few heads were grouped: Rasseneur pale with disgust, Zacharie and Philoméne stupefied at what they had seen. The two old men, Bonnemort and Mouque, were gravely shaking their heads. Only Jeanlin was making fun, pushing Bébert with his elbow, and forcing Lydie to look up. But the women were already coming back, turning round and passing beneath the manager's windows. Behind the blinds the ladies were stretching out their necks. They had not been able to observe the scene, which was hidden from them by the wall, and they could not distinguish well in the growing darkness. "What is it they have at the end of that stick?" asked Cécile, who had grown bold enough to look out. Lucie and Jeanne declared that it must be a rabbit's skin. "No, no," murmured Madame Hennebeau. "They must have been pillaging a pork butcher's. It seems to be a remnant of a pig." At this moment she shuddered, and was silent. Madame Grégoire had nudged her with her knee. They both remained stupefied. The young ladies, who were very pale, asked no more questions, but with large eyes followed this red vision through the darkness. Étienne once more brandished the axe. But the feeling of anxiety did not disappear. This corpse now barred the road and protected the shop. Many had drawn back. Satiety seemed to have appeased them all. Maheu was standing by gloomily, when he heard a voice whisper in his ear to escape. He turned round and recognized Catherine, still in her old overcoat, black and panting. With a movement he repelled her. He would not listen to her. He threatened to strike her. With a gesture of despair she hesitated, and then ran towards Étienne. "Save yourself! Save yourself! The gendarmes are coming!" He also pushed her away and abused her, feeling the blood of the blows she had given him mounting to his cheeks. But she would not be repelled. She forced him to throw down the axe, and drew him away by both arms, with irresistible strength. "Don't I tell you the gendarmes are coming? Listen to me. It's Chaval who has gone for them and is bringing them, if you want to know. It's too much for me, and I've come. Save yourself. I don't want them to take you." And Catherine drew him away, while, at the same instant, a heavy gallop shook the street from afar. Immediately a voice arose: "The gendarmes! The gendarmes!" There was a general breaking up, so mad a rush for life, that in 2 minutes the road was free, absolutely clear, as though swept by a hurricane. Maigrat's corpse alone made a patch of shadow on the white earth. Before the Estaminet Tison, Rasseneur only remained, feeling relieved, and with open face applauding the easy victory of the sabres. While in dim and deserted Montsou, in the silence of the closed houses, the bourgeois remained with perspiring skins and chattering teeth, not daring to look out. The plain was drowned beneath the thick night. Only the blast furnaces and the coke furnaces were burning against the tragic sky. The gallop of the gendarmes heavily approached. They came up in an indistinguishable, sombre mass, and behind them the Marchiennes pastry cook's vehicle, a little covered cart which had been confided to their care, at last arrived, and a small drudge of a boy jumped down and quietly unpacked the crust for the vol au vent. Section 30 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 6, Chapter 1. The first fortnight of February passed, and a black cold prolonged the hard winter without pity for the poor. Once more the authorities had scoured the roads. The prefect of Lille, an attorney general, and the police were not sufficient. The military had come to occupy Montsou. A whole regiment of men were camped between Beaugnies and Marchiennes. Armed pickets guarded the pits, and there were soldiers before every engine. The manager's villa, the Company's yards, even the houses of certain residents, were bristling with bayonets. Nothing was heard along the streets but the slow movement of patrols. On the pit bank of the Voreux a sentinel was always placed in the frozen wind that blew up there, like a lookout man above the flat plain; and every 2 hours, as though in an enemy's country, were heard the sentry's cries: "Qui vive? Advance, and give the password." Nowhere had work been resumed. On the contrary, the strike had spread. Crévecoeur, Mirou, Madeleine, like the Voreux, were producing nothing. At Feutry and the Victoire there were fewer men every morning. Even at Saint Thomas, which had been hitherto exempt, men were wanting. There was now a silent persistence in the face of this exhibition of force which exasperated the miners' pride. The settlements looked deserted in the midst of the beetroot fields. Not a workman stirred; only at rare intervals was one to be met by chance, isolated, with sidelong look, lowering his head before the red trousers. And in this deep melancholy calm, in this passive opposition to the guns, there was a deceptive gentleness, a forced and patient obedience of wild beasts in a cage, with their eyes on the tamer, ready to spring on his neck if he turned his back. The Company, who were being ruined by this death of work, talked of hiring miners from the Borinage, on the Belgian frontier, but did not dare; so that the battle continued as before between the colliers who were shut up at home and the dead pits guarded by soldiery. On the morrow of that terrible day this calm had come about at once, hiding such a panic that the greatest silence possible was kept concerning the damage and the atrocities. The inquiry which had been opened showed that Maigrat had died from his fall, and the frightful mutilation of the corpse remained uncertain, already surrounded by a legend. On its side, the Company did not acknowledge the disasters it had suffered, any more than the Grégoires cared to compromise their daughter in the scandal of a trial in which she would have to give evidence. However, some arrests took place, mere supernumeraries as usual, silly and frightened, knowing nothing. By mistake, Pierron was taken off with handcuffs on his wrists as far as Marchiennes, to the great amusement of his mates. Rasseneur also was nearly arrested by 2 gendarmes. The management was content with preparing lists of names, and giving back certificates in large numbers. Maheu had received his. Levaque also, as well as 34 of their mates in the settlement of the Deux Cent Quarante alone. And all the severity was directed against Étienne, who had disappeared on the evening of the fray, and who was being sought, although no trace of him could be found. Chaval, in his hatred, had denounced him, refusing to name the others at Catherine's appeal, for she wished to save her parents. The days passed. Every one felt that nothing was yet concluded, and with oppressed hearts every one was awaiting the end. At Montsou, during this period, the inhabitants awoke with a start every night, their ears buzzing with an imaginary alarm bell, and their nostrils haunted by the smell of powder. But what completed their discomfiture was a sermon by the new curé, Abbé Ranvier, that lean priest with eyes like red hot coals who had succeeded Abbé Joire. He was indeed unlike the smiling, discreet man, so fat and gentle, whose only anxiety was to live at peace with everybody. Abbé Ranvier went so far as to defend these abominable brigands who had dishonoured the district. He found excuses for the atrocities of the strikers, he violently attacked the middle class, throwing on them the whole of the responsibility. It was the middle class which, by dispossessing the church of its ancient liberties in order to misuse them itself, had turned this world into a cursed place of injustice and suffering. It was the middle class which prolonged misunderstandings, which was pushing on towards a terrible catastrophe by its atheism, by its refusal to return to the old beliefs, to the fraternity of the early Christians. And he dared to threaten the rich! He warned them that if they obstinately persisted in refusing to listen to the voice of God, God would surely put himself on the side of the poor. He would take back their fortunes from those who faithlessly enjoyed them, and would distribute them to the humble of the earth for the triumph of his glory. The devout trembled at this. The lawyer declared that it was socialism of the worst kind. All saw the curé at the head of a band, brandishing a cross, and with vigorous blows demolishing the bourgeois society of '89. M. Hennebeau, when informed, contented himself with saying, as he shrugged his shoulders: "If he troubles us too much, the bishop will free us from him." And while the breath of panic was thus blowing from one end of the plain to the other, Étienne was dwelling beneath the earth, in Jeanlin's burrow at the bottom of Réquillart. It was there that he was in hiding. No one believed him so near. The quiet audacity of that refuge, in the very mine, in that abandoned passage of the old pit, had baffled search. Above, the sloes and hawthorns growing among the fallen scaffolding of the belfry filled up the mouth of the hole. No one ventured down. It was necessary to know the trick, how to hang on to the roots of the mountain ash, and to let go fearlessly, to catch hold of the rungs that were still solid. Other obstacles also protected him. The suffocating heat of the passage, 120 metres of dangerous descent, then the painful gliding on all fours for a quarter of a league between the narrowed walls of the gallery before discovering the brigands' cave full of plunder. He lived there in the midst of abundance, finding gin there, the rest of the dried cod, and provisions of all sorts. The large hay bed was excellent, and not a current of air could be felt in this equal temperature, as warm as a bath. Light, however, threatened to fail. Jeanlin, who had made himself purveyor with the prudence and discretion of a savage, and delighted to make fun of the police, had even brought him pomatum, but could not succeed in putting his hands on a packet of candles. After the fifth day, Étienne never lighted up except to eat. He could not swallow in the dark. This complete and interminable night, always of the same blackness, was his chief torment. It was in vain that he was able to sleep in safety, that he was warm and provided with bread. The night had never weighed so heavily on his brain. It seemed to him even to crush his thoughts. Now he was living on thefts. In spite of his communistic theories, old scruples of education arose, and he contented himself with gnawing his share of dry bread. But what was to be done? One must live, and his task was not yet accomplished. Another shame overcame him, remorse for that savage drunkenness from the gin, drunk in the great cold on an empty stomach, which had thrown him, armed with a knife, on Chaval. This stirred in him the whole of that unknown terror, the hereditary ill, the long ancestry of drunkenness, no longer tolerating a drop of alcohol without falling into homicidal mania. Would he then end as a murderer? When he found himself in shelter, in this profound calm of the earth, seized by satiety of violence, he had slept for 2 days the sleep of a brute, gorged and overcome. And the depression continued. He lived in a bruised state, with bitter mouth and aching head, as after some tremendous spree. A week passed by. The Maheus, who had been warned, were not able to send a candle. He had to give up the enjoyment of light, even when eating. Now Étienne remained for hours stretched out on his hay. Vague ideas were working within him for the first time, a feeling of superiority which placed him apart from his mates, an exaltation of his person as he grew more instructed. Never had he reflected so much. He asked himself the why of his disgust on the morrow of that furious course among the pits, and he did not dare to reply to himself. His recollections were repulsive to him, the ignoble desires, the coarse instincts, the odour of all that wretchedness shaken out to the wind. In spite of the torment of the darkness, he would come to hate the hour for returning to the settlement. How nauseous were all these wretches in a heap, living at the common bucket! There was not one of them with whom he could seriously talk politics. It was a bestial existence, always the same air tainted by onion, in which one choked. He wished to enlarge their horizon, to raise them to the comfort and good manners of the middle class, by making them masters, but how long it would take! And he no longer felt the courage to await victory, in this prison of hunger. By slow degrees his vanity of leadership, his constant preoccupation of thinking in their place, left him free, breathing into him the soul of one of those bourgeois whom he execrated. Jeanlin one evening brought a candle end, stolen from a carter's lantern, and this was a great relief for Étienne. When the darkness began to stupefy him, weighing on his skull almost to madness, he would light up for a moment. Then, as soon as he had chased away the nightmare, he extinguished the candle, miserly of this brightness which was as necessary to his life as bread. The silence buzzed in his ears. He only heard the flight of a band of rats, the cracking of the old timber, the tiny sound of a spider weaving her web. And with eyes open, in this warm nothingness, he returned to his fixed idea, the thought of what his mates were doing above. Desertion on his part would have seemed to him the worst cowardice. If he thus hid himself, it was to remain free, to give counsel or to act. His long meditations had fixed his ambition. While awaiting something better, he would like to be Pluchart, leaving manual work in order to work only at politics, but alone, in a clean room, under the pretext that brain labour absorbs the entire life and needs quiet. At the beginning of the second week, the child having told him that the police supposed he had gone over to Belgium, Étienne ventured out of his hole at nightfall. He wished to ascertain the situation, and to decide if it was still well to persist. He himself considered the game doubtful. Before the strike he felt uncertain of the result, and had simply yielded to facts. And now, after having been intoxicated with rebellion, he came back to this first doubt, despairing of making the Company yield. But he would not yet confess this to himself. He was tortured when he thought of the miseries of defeat, and the heavy responsibility of suffering which would weigh upon him. The end of the strike! Was it not the end of his part, the overthrow of his ambition, his life falling back into the brutishness of the mine and the horrors of the settlement? And honestly, without any base calculation or falsehood, he endeavoured to find his faith again, to prove to himself that resistance was still possible, that capital was about to destroy itself and face the heroic suicide of labour. Throughout the entire country, in fact, there was nothing but a long echo of ruin. At night, when he wandered through the black country, like a wolf who has come out of his forest, he seemed to hear the crash of bankruptcies from one end of the plain to the other. He now passed by the roadside nothing but closed dead workshops, becoming rotten beneath the dull sky. The sugar works had especially suffered, the Houlton sugar works, the Fauvelle works, after having reduced the number of their hands, had come to grief one after the other. At the Dutilleul flour works, the last mill had stopped on the second Saturday of the month, and the Bleuze rope works, for mine cables, had been quite ruined by the strike. On the Marchiennes side the situation was growing worse every day. All the fires were out at the Gagebois glassworks. Men were continually being sent away from the Saintville workshops. Only one of the 3 blast furnaces of the forges was alight, and not one battery of coke ovens was burning on the horizon. The strike of the Montsou colliers, born of the industrial crisis which had been growing worse for 2 years, had increased it and precipitated the downfall. To the other causes of suffering, the stoppage of orders from America, and the engorgement of invested capital in excessive production, was now added the unforeseen lack of coal for the few furnaces which were still kept up. And that was the supreme agony, this engine bread which the pits no longer furnished. Frightened by the general anxiety, the Company, by diminishing its output and starving its miners, inevitably found itself at the end of December without a fragment of coal at the surface of its pits. Everything held together, the plague blew from afar. One fall led to another, the industries tumbled each other over as they fell, in so rapid a series of catastrophes that the shocks echoed in the midst of the neighbouring cities, Lille, Douai, Valenciennes, where absconding bankers were bringing ruin on whole families. At the turn of a road Étienne often stopped in the frozen night to hear the rubbish raining down. He breathed deeply in the darkness. The joy of annihilation seized him, the hope that day would dawn on the extermination of the old world, with not a single fortune left standing, the scythe of equality levelling everything to the ground. But in this massacre it was the Company's pits that especially interested him. He would continue his walk, blinded by the darkness, visiting them one after the other, glad to discover some new disaster. Landslips of increasing gravity continued to occur on account of the prolonged abandonment of passages. Above the north gallery of Mirou the ground sank in to such an extent that the Joiselle road, for the distance of 100 metres, had been swallowed up as though by the shock of an earthquake. And the Company, disturbed at the rumours raised by these accidents, paid the owners for their vanished fields without bargaining. Crévecoeur and Madeleine, which lay in very shifting rock, were becoming stopped up more and more. It was said that 2 captains had been buried at the Victoire. There was an inundation at Feutry Cantel. It had been necessary to wall up a gallery for the length of a kilometre at Saint Thomas, where the ill kept timbering was breaking down everywhere. Thus, every hour, enormous sums were spent, making great breaches in the shareholders' dividends. A rapid destruction of the pits was going on, which must end at last by eating up the famous Montsou deniers which had been centupled in a century. In the face of these repeated blows, hope was again born in Étienne. He came to believe that a third month of resistance would crush the monster, the weary, sated beast, crouching down there like an idol in his unknown tabernacle. He knew that after the Montsou troubles there had been great excitement in the Paris journals, quite a violent controversy between the official newspapers and the opposition newspapers, terrible narratives which were especially directed against the International, of which the Empire was becoming afraid after having first encouraged it, and the directors not daring to turn a deaf ear any longer. 2 of them had condescended to come and hold an inquiry, but with an air of regret, not appearing to care about the upshot, so disinterested that in 3 days they went away again, declaring that everything was going on as well as possible. He was told, however, from other quarters, that during their stay these gentlemen sat permanently, displaying feverish activity, and absorbed in transactions of which no one about them uttered a word. And he charged them with affecting confidence they did not feel, and came to look upon their departure as a nervous flight, feeling now certain of triumph, since these terrible men were letting everything go. But on the following night Étienne despaired again. The Company's back was too robust to be so easily broken. They might lose millions, but later on they would get them back again by gnawing at their men's bread. On that night, having pushed as far as Jean Bart, he guessed the truth when an overseer told him that there was talk of yielding Vandame to Montsou. At Deneulin house, it was said, the wretchedness was pitiful, the wretchedness of the rich. The father ill in his powerlessness, aged by his anxiety over money, the daughters struggling in the midst of tradesmen, trying to save their shifts. There was less suffering in the famished settlements than in this middle class house where they shut themselves up to drink water. Work had not been resumed at Jean Bart, and it had been necessary to replace the pump at Gaston Marie, while, in spite of all haste, an inundation had already begun which made great expenses necessary. Deneulin had at last risked his request for a loan of 100,000 francs from the Grégoires, and the refusal, though he had expected it, completed his dejection. If they refused, it was for his sake. in order to save him from an impossible struggle, and they advised him to sell. He, as usual, violently refused. It enraged him to have to pay the expenses of the strike. He hoped at first to die of it, with the blood at his head, strangled by apoplexy. Then what was to be done? He had listened to the directors' offers. They wrangled with him, they depreciated this superb prey, this repaired pit, equipped anew, where the lack of capital alone paralysed the output. He would be lucky if he got enough out of it to satisfy his creditors. For 2 days he had struggled against the directors at Montsou, furious at the quiet way with which they took advantage of his embarrassment and shouting his refusals at them in his loud voice. And there the affair remained, and they had returned to Paris to await patiently his last groans. Étienne smelled out this compensation for the disasters, and was again seized by discouragement before the invincible power of the great capitalists, so strong in battle that they fattened in defeat by eating the corpses of the small capitalists who fell at their side. The next day, fortunately, Jeanlin brought him a piece of good news. At the Voreux, the tubbing of the shaft was threatening to break, and the water was filtering in from all the joints. In great haste a gang of carpenters had been set on to repair it. Up to now Étienne had avoided the Voreux, warned by the everlasting black silhouette of the sentinel stationed on the pit bank above the plain. He could not be avoided; he dominated in the air, like the flag of the regiment. Towards 3 o'clock in the morning the sky became overcast, and he went to the pit, where some mates explained to him the bad condition of the tubbing. They even thought it would have to be done entirely over again, which would stop the output of coal for 3 months. For a long time he prowled round, listening to the carpenters' mallets hammering in the shaft. That wound which had to be dressed rejoiced his heart. As he went back in the early daylight, he saw the sentinel still on the pit bank. This time he would certainly be seen. As he walked he thought about those soldiers who were taken from the people, to be armed against the people. How easy the triumph of the revolution would be if the army were suddenly to declare for it! It would be enough if the workman and the peasant in the barracks were to remember their origin. That was the supreme peril, the great terror, which made the teeth of the middle class chatter when they thought of a possible defection of the troops. In 2 hours they would be swept away and exterminated with all the delights and abominations of their iniquitous life. It was already said that whole regiments were tainted with socialism. Was it true? When justice came, would it be thanks to the cartridges distributed by the middle class? And snatching at another hope, the young man dreamed that the regiment, with its posts, now guarding the pits, would come over to the side of the strikers, shoot down the company, to a man, and at last give the mine to the miners. He then noticed that he was ascending the pit bank, his head filled with these reflections. Why should he not talk with this soldier? He would get to know what his ideas were. With an air of indifference he continued to come nearer, as though he were gleaning old wood among the rubbish. The sentinel remained motionless. "Eh, mate! Damned weather!" said Étienne at last. "I think we shall have snow." He was a small soldier, very fair, with a pale, gentle face covered with red freckles. He wore his military greatcoat with the awkwardness of a recruit. "Yes, perhaps we shall, I think," he murmured. And with his blue eyes he gazed at the livid sky, at a smoky dawn, with soot weighing like lead afar over the plain. "What idiots they are to put you here to freeze!" Étienne went on. "One would think the Cossacks were coming, and then there's always wind here." The little soldier shivered without complaining. There was certainly a little cabin of dry stones there, where old Bonnemort used to take shelter when it blew a hurricane. But the order being not to leave the summit of the pit bank, the soldier did not stir from it, his hands so stiffened by cold that he could no longer feel his weapon. He belonged to the guard of 60 men who were protecting the Voreux, and as this cruel sentry duty frequently came round, he had before nearly stayed there for good with his dead feet. His work demanded it. A passive obedience finished the benumbing process, and he replied to these questions with the stammered words of a sleepy child. Étienne in vain endeavoured during a quarter of an hour to make him talk about politics. He replied "yes" or "no" without seeming to understand. Some of his comrades said that the captain was a Republican. As to him, he had no idea; it was all the same to him. If he was ordered to fire, he would fire, so as not to be punished. The workmen listened, seized with the popular hatred against the army, against these brothers whose hearts were changed by sticking a pair of red pantaloons on to their buttocks. "Then what's your name?" "Jules." "And where do you come from?" "From Plogof, over there." He stretched out his arm at random. It was in Brittany, he knew no more. His small pale face grew animated. He began to laugh, and felt warmer. "I have a mother and a sister. They are waiting for me, sure enough. Ah, it won't be for tomorrow. When I left, they came with me as far as Pont l'Abbé. We had to take the horse to Les Pommes. It nearly broke its legs at the bottom of the Audierne hill. Cousin Charles was waiting for us with sausages, but the women were crying too much, and it stuck in our throats. Good Lord, what a long way off our home is!" His eyes grew moist, though he was still laughing. The desert moorland of Plogof, that wild, storm beaten point of the Raz, appeared to him beneath a dazzling sun in the rosy season of heather. "Do you think," he asked, "if I'm not punished, that they'll give me a month's leave in 2 years?" Then Étienne talked about Provence, which he had left when he was quite small. The daylight was growing, and flakes of snow began to fly earthy sky. And at last he felt anxious on noticing Jeanlin, who was prowling about in the midst of the bushes, stupefied to see him up there. The child was beckoning to him. What was the good of this dream of fraternizing with the soldiers? It would take years and years, and his useless attempt cast him down as though he had expected to succeed. But suddenly he understood Jeanlin's gesture. The sentinel was about to be relieved, and he went away, running off to bury himself at Réquillart, his heart crushed once more by the certainty of defeat, while the little scamp who ran beside him was accusing that dirty beast of a trooper of having called out the guard to fire at them. On the summit of the pit bank Jules stood motionless, with eyes vacantly gazing at the falling snow. The sergeant was approaching with his men, and the regulation cries were exchanged. "Qui vive?" "Advance and give the password." And they heard the heavy steps begin again, ringing as though on a conquered country. In spite of the growing daylight, nothing stirred in the settlements. The colliers remained in silent rage beneath the military boot. End of Section 30. Section 31 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Manperard. Part 6. Chapter 2. Snow had been falling for 2 days. Since the morning it had ceased, and an intense frost had frozen the immense sheet. This black country, with its inky roads and walls and trees powdered with coal dust, was now white, a single whiteness stretching out without end. The Deux Cent Quarante settlement lay beneath the snow as though it had disappeared. No smoke came out of the chimneys. The houses, without fire and as cold as the stones in the street, did not melt the thick layer on the tiles. It was nothing more than a quarry of white slabs in the white plain, a vision of a dead village wound in its shroud. Along the roads the passing patrols alone made a muddy mess with their stamping. Among the Maheus the last shovelful of cinders had been burnt the evening before, and it was no use any longer to think of gleaning on the pit bank in this terrible weather, when the sparrows themselves could not find a blade of grass. Alzire, from the obstinacy with which her poor hands had dug in the snow, was dying. Maheude had to wrap her up in the fragment of a coverlet while waiting for Dr. Vanderhaghen, for whom she had twice gone up without being able to find him. The servant had, however, promised that he would come to the settlement before night, and the mother was standing at the window watching, while the little invalid, who had wished to be downstairs, was shivering on a chair, having the illusion that it was better there near the cold grate. Old Bonnemort, opposite, his legs bad once more, seemed to be sleeping. Neither Lénore or Henri had come back from scouring the roads, in company with Jeanlin, to ask for sous. Maheu alone was walking heavily up and down the bare room, stumbling against the wall at every turn, with the stupid air of an animal which can no longer see its cage. The petroleum also was finished, but the reflection of the snow from outside was so bright that it vaguely lit up the room, in spite of the deepening night. There was a noise of sabots, and the Levaque woman pushed open the door like a gale of wind, beside herself, shouting furiously from the threshold at Maheude: "Then it's you who have said that I forced my lodger to give me 20 sous when he sleeps with me?" The other shrugged her shoulders. "Don't bother me. I said nothing. And who told you so?" "They tell me you said so. It doesn't concern you who it was. You even said you could hear us at our dirty tricks behind the wall, and that the filth gets into our house because I'm always on my back. Just tell me you didn't say so, eh?" Every day quarrels broke out as a result of the constant gossiping of the women. Especially between those households which lived door to door, squabbles and reconciliations took place every day. But never before had such bitterness thrown them one against the other. Since the strike, hunger exasperated their rancour, so that they felt the need of blows. An altercation between two gossiping women finished by a murderous onset between their two men. Just then Levaque arrived in his turn, dragging Bouteloup. "Here's our mate. Let him just say if he has given 20 sous to my wife to sleep with her." The lodger, hiding his timid gentleness in his great beard, protested and stammered: "Oh, that! No, never anything, never!" At once Levaque became threatening, and thrust his fist beneath Maheu's nose. "You know that won't do for me. If a man's got a wife like that, he ought to knock her ribs in. If not, then you believe what she says." "By God!" exclaimed Maheu, furious at being dragged out of his dejection. "What is all this clatter again? Haven't we got enough to do with our misery? Just leave me alone, damn you, or I'll let you know it. And first, who says that my wife said so?" "Who says so? Pierron said so." Maheu broke into a sharp laugh, and turning towards the Levaque woman: "Ah! Pierron, is it? Well, I can tell you what she told me. Yes, she told me that you sleep with both your men, the one underneath and the other on top." After that it was no longer possible to come to an understanding. They all grew angry, and the Levaques, as a reply to the Maheus, asserted that Pierron had said a good many other things on their account, that they had sold Catherine, that they were all rotten together, even to the little ones with a dirty disease caught by Étienne at the Volcan. "She said that! She said that!" yelled Maheu. "Good! I'll go to her, I will. And if she says that she said that, she shall feel my hand on her chops." He was carried out of himself, and the Levaques followed him to see what would happen, while Bouteloup, having a horror of disputes, furtively returned home. Excited by the altercation, Maheude was also going out, when a complaint from Alzire held her back. She crossed the ends of the coverlet over the little one's quivering body, and placed herself before the window, looking out vaguely. And that doctor, who still delayed! At the Pierrons' door, Maheu and the Levaques met Lydie, who was stamping in the snow. The house was closed, and a thread of light came through a crack in a shutter. The child replied at first to their questions with constraint. No, her father was not there. He had gone to the wash house to join Mother Brulé and bring back the bundle of linen. Then she was confused, and would not say what her mother was doing. At last she let out everything, with a sly, spiteful laugh. Her mother had pushed her out of the door because Monsieur Dansaert was there, and she prevented them from talking. Since the morning he had been going about the settlement with two policemen trying to pick up workmen, imposing on the weak, and announcing everywhere that if the descent did not take place on Monday at the Voreux, the Company had decided to hire men from the Borinage. And as the night came on he sent away the policemen. finding Pierron alone. Then he had remained with her to drink a glass of gin before a good fire. "Hush! hold your tongue! We must see them," said Levaque, with a lewd laugh. "We'll explain everything directly. Get off with you, youngster." Lydie drew back a few steps while he put his eye to a crack in the shutter. He stifled a low cry and his back bent with a quiver. In her turn, his wife looked through, but she said, as though taken by the colic, that it was disgusting. Maheu, who had pushed her, wishing also to see, then declared that he had had enough for his money, and they began again, in a row, each taking his glass as at a peep show. The parlour, glittering with cleanliness, was enlivened by a large fire. There were cakes on the table with a bottle and glasses; in fact, quite a feast. What they saw going on in there at last exasperated the two men, who under other circumstances would have laughed over it for 6 months. That she should let herself be stuffed up to the neck, with her skirts in the air, was funny. But, good God! was it not disgusting to do that in front of a great fire, and to get up one's strength with biscuits, when the maids had neither a slice of bread nor a fragment of coal? "Here's father!" cried Lydie, running away. Pierron was quietly coming back from the wash house with a bundle of linen on his shoulder. Maheu immediately addressed him. "Here, they tell me that your wife says that I sold Catherine, and that we are all rotten at home. And what do they pay you in your house, your wife and the gentleman who is this minute wearing out her skin?" The astonished Pierron could not understand, and Pierronne, seized with fear on hearing the tumult of voices, lost her head and set the door ajar to see what was the matter. They could see her, looking very red, with her dress open and her skirt tucked up at her waist, while Dansaert, in the background, was wildly buttoning himself up. The head captain rushed away and disappeared trembling with fear that this story would reach the manager's ears. Then there would be an awful scandal, laughter and hooting and abuse. "You, who are always saying that other people are dirty!" shouted the Levaque woman to Pierron. "It's not surprising that you're clean when you get the bosses to scour you." "Ah, it's fine for her to talk," said Levaque again. "Here's a trollop who says that my wife sleeps with me and the lodger, one below and the other above. Yes, yes, that's what they tell me you say." But Pierron, grown calm, held her own against this abuse, very contemptuous in the assurance that she was the best looking and the richest. "I've said what I've said. Just leave me alone, will you? What have my affairs got to do with you, a pack of jealous creatures who want to get over us because we are able to save up money? Get along, get along! You can say what you like. My husband knows well enough why Monsieur Dansaert was here." Pierron, in fact, was furiously defending his wife. The quarrel turned. They accused him of having sold himself, of being a spy, the Company's dog. They charged him with shutting himself up to gorge himself with the good things with which the bosses paid him for his treachery. In defence, he pretended that Maheu had slipped beneath his door a threatening paper, with 2 crossbones and a dagger above; and this necessarily ended in a struggle between the men, as the quarrels of the women always did now that famine was enraging the mildest. Maheu and Levaque rushed on Pierron with their fists, and had to be pulled off. Blood was flowing from her son in law's nose when Mother Brulé, in her turn, arrived from the wash house. When informed of what had been going on, she merely said: "The damned beast dishonours me." The road was becoming deserted. Not a shadow spotted the naked whiteness of the snow, and the settlement, falling back into its deathlike immobility, went on starving beneath the intense cold. "And the doctor?" asked Maheu, as he shut the door. "Not come," replied Maheude, still standing before the window. "Are the little ones back?" "No, not back." Maheu again began his heavy walk from one wall to the other, looking like a stricken ox. Father Bonnemort, sitting stiffly on his chair, had not even lifted his head. Alzire also had said nothing, and was trying not to shiver, so as to avoid giving them pain. But in spite of her courage and suffering, she sometimes trembled so much that one could hear against the coverlet the quivering of the little invalid girl's lean body, while with her large open eyes She stared at the ceiling, from which the pale reflection of the white gardens lit up the room like moonshine. The emptied house was now in its last agony, having reached a final stage of nakedness. The mattress ticks had followed the wool to the dealers, then the sheets had gone, the linen, everything that could be sold. One evening they had sold a handkerchief of the grandfather's for 2 sous. Tears fell over each object of the poor household which had to go, and the mother was still lamenting that one day she had carried away in her skirt the pink cardboard box, her man's old present, as one would carry away a child to get rid of it on some doorstep. They were bare. They had only their skins left to sell, so worn out and injured that no one would have given a farthing for them. They no longer even took the trouble to search. They knew that there was nothing left, that they had come to the end of everything, that they must not hope even for a candle or a fragment of coal or a potato, and they were waiting to die, only grieved about the children, and revolted by the useless cruelty that gave the little one a disease before starving it. "At last, here he is!" said Maheude. A black figure passed before the window. The door opened, but it was not Dr. Vanderhaghen. They recognized the new curé, Abbé Ranvier, who did not seem surprised at coming on this dead house, without light, without fire, without bread. He had already been to 3 neighbouring houses, going from family to family, seeking willing listeners, like Dansaert with his 2 policemen, and at once he exclaimed, in his feverish fanatic's voice: "Why were you not at mass on Sunday, my children? You are wrong. The church alone can save you. Now promise me to come next Sunday." Maheu, after staring at him, went on pacing heavily, without a word. It was Maheude who replied: "To mass, sir? What for? Isn't the good God making fun of us? Look here, what has my little girl there done to him, to be shaking with fever? Hadn't we enough misery, that he had to make her ill too, just when I can't even give her a cup of warm gruel?" Then the priest stood and talked at length. He spoke of the strike, this terrible wretchedness, this exasperated rancour of famine, with the ardour of a missionary who was preaching to savages for the glory of religion. He said that the church was with the poor, that she would one day cause justice to triumph by calling down the anger of God on the iniquities of the rich. And that day would come soon, for the rich had taken the place of God, and were governing without God in their impious theft of power. But if the workers desired their fair division of the goods of the earth, they ought at once to put themselves in the hands of the priests, just as on the death of Jesus the poor and the humble grouped themselves around the apostles. What strength the Pope would have, what an army the clergy would have under them, when they were able to command the numberless crowd of workers! In 1 week they would purge the world of the wicked, they would chase away the unworthy masters. Then, indeed, there would be a real kingdom of God, every one recompensed according to his merits, and the law of labour as the foundation for universal happiness. Maheude, who was listening to him, seemed to hear Étienne in those autumn evenings when he announced to them the end of their evils, only she had always distrusted the cloth. "That's very well what you say there, sir," she replied, "but that's because you no longer agree with the bourgeois. All our other curés dined at the manager's and threatened us with the devil as soon as we asked for bread." He began again, and spoke of the deplorable misunderstanding between the church and the people. Now, in veiled phrases, he hit at the town curés, at the bishops, at the highly placed clergy, sated with enjoyment, gorged with domination, making pacts with the liberal middle class, in the imbecility of their blindness, not seeing that it was this middle class which had dispossessed them of the empire of the world. Deliverance would come from the country priests, who would all rise to re establish the kingdom of Christ, with the help of the poor. And already he seemed to be at their head. He raised his bony form like the chief of a band, a revolutionary of the gospel, his eyes so filled with light that they illuminated the gloomy room. This enthusiastic sermon lifted him to mystic heights, and the poor people had long ceased to understand him. "No need for so many words!" growled Maheu suddenly. "You'd best begin by bringing us a loaf." "Come on Sunday to mass," cried the priest. "God will provide for everything." And he went off to catechize the Levaques in their turn, so carried away by his dream of the final triumph of the church, and so contemptuous of facts, that he would thus go through the settlements without charities, with empty hands, amid this army dying of hunger, being a poor devil himself, who looked upon suffering as the spur to salvation. Maheu continued his pacing, and nothing was heard but his regular tramp which made the floor tremble. There was the sound of a rust-eaten pulley. Old Bonnemort was spitting into the cold grate. Then the rhythm of the feet began again. Alzire, weakened by fever, was rambling in a low voice, laughing, thinking that it was warm and that she was playing in the sun. "Good gracious!" muttered Maheude after having touched her cheeks. "How she burns! I don't expect that damned beast now; the brigands must have stopped him from coming." She meant the doctor and the company. She uttered a joyous exclamation, however, when the door once more opened. But her arms fell back and she remained standing still with gloomy face. "Good evening," whispered Étienne, when he had carefully closed the door. He often came thus at night time. The Maheus learnt his retreat after the second day. But they kept the secret and no one in the settlement knew exactly what had become of the young man. A legend had grown up around him. People still believed in him, and mysterious rumours circulated. He would reappear with an army and chests full of gold. And there was always the religious expectation of a miracle, the realized ideal, a sudden entry into that city of justice which he had promised them. Some said that they had seen him lying back in a carriage with three other gentlemen on the Marchiennes road. Others affirmed that he was in England for a few days. At length, however, suspicions began to arise, and jokers accused him of hiding in a cellar where Mouquette kept him warm; for this relationship, when known, had done him harm. There was a growing disaffection in the midst of his popularity, a gradual increase of the despairing among the faithful, and their number was certain, little by little, to grow. "What brutal weather!" he added. "And you? Nothing new? Always from bad to worse? They tell me that little Négrel has been to Belgium to get Borains. Good God! We are done for if that is true." He shuddered as he entered this dark icy room, where it was some time before his eyes were able to see the unfortunate people, whose presence he guessed by the deepening of the shade. He was experiencing the repugnance and discomfort of the workman who has risen above his class, refined by study and stimulated by ambition. What wretchedness! And odours! And the bodies in a heap! And a terrible pity caught him by the throat. The spectacle of this agony so overcame him that he tried to find words to advise submission. But Maheu came violently up to him, shouting: "Borains! They won't dare, the bloody fools! Let the Borains go down, then, if they want us to destroy the pits!" With an air of constraint, Étienne explained that it was not possible to move, that the soldiers who guarded the pits would protect the descent of the Belgian workmen; and Maheu clenched his fists, irritated especially, as he said, by having bayonets in his back. Then the colliers were no longer masters in their own place? They were treated, then, like convicts, forced to work by a loaded musket. He loved his pit. It was a great grief to him not to have been down for 2 months. He was driven wild, therefore, at the idea of this insult, these strangers whom they threatened to introduce. Then the recollection that his certificate had been given back to him struck him to the heart. "I don't know why I'm angry," he muttered. "I don't belong to their shop any longer. When they have hunted me away from here, I may as well die on the road." "As to that," said Étienne, "if you like, they'll take your certificate back to morrow. People don't send away good workmen." He interrupted himself, surprised to hear Alzire, who was laughing softly in the delirium of her fever. So far he had only made out Father Bonnemont's stiff shadow, and this gaiety of the sick child frightened him. It was indeed too much if the little ones were going to die of it. With trembling voice he made up his mind. "Look here, this can't go on. We are done for. We must give it up." Maheude, who had been motionless and silent up to now, suddenly broke out, and treating him familiarly and swearing like a man, she shouted in his face: "What's that you say? It's you who say that, by God!" He was about to give reasons, but she would not let him speak. "Don't repeat that, by God, or, woman as I am, I'll put my fist into your face. Then we have been dying for 2 months, and I have sold my household, and my little ones have fallen ill of it, and there is to be nothing done, and the injustice is to begin again. Ah! Do you know, when I think of that, my blood stands still? No, no! I would burn everything, I would kill everything, rather than give up." She pointed at Maheu in the darkness, with a vague, threatening gesture. "Listen to this! If any man goes back to the pit, he'll find me waiting for him on the road, to spit in his face and cry 'Coward!'" Étienne could not see her, but he felt a heat like the breath of a barking animal. He had drawn back, astonished at this fury which was his work. She was so changed that he could no longer recognize the woman who was once so sensible, reproving his violent schemes, saying that we ought not to wish any one dead, and who was now refusing to listen to reason and talking of killing people. It was not he now, it was she, who talked politics, who dreamed of sweeping away the bourgeois at a stroke, who demanded the republic and the guillotine to free the earth of these rich robbers who fattened on the labour of starvelings. Yes, I could flay them with my fingers. We've had enough of them. Our turn has come now. You used to say so yourself. When I think of the father, the grandfather, the grandfather's father, what all of them who went before have suffered, what we are suffering, and that our sons and our sons' sons will suffer it over again, it makes me mad. I could take a knife. The other day we didn't do enough at Montsou. We ought to have pulled the bloody place to the ground, down to the last brick. And do you know, I've only one regret, that we didn't let the old man strangle the Piolaine girl. Hunger may strangle my little ones, for all they care." Her words fell like the blows of an axe in the night. The closed horizon would not open, and the impossible ideal was turning to poison in the depths of this skull which had been crushed by grief. "You have misunderstood," Étienne was able to say at last, beating a retreat. "We ought to come to an understanding with the Company. I know that the pits are suffering much, so that it would probably consent to an arrangement." "No, never!" she shouted. Just then Lénore and Henri came back with their hands empty. A gentleman had certainly given them 2 sous, but the girl kept kicking her little brother, and the 2 sous fell into the snow, and as Jeanlin had joined in the search, they had not been able to find them. "Where is Jeanlin?" "He's gone away, mother. He said he had business." Étienne was listening with an aching heart. Once she had threatened to kill them if they ever held out their hands to beg. Now she sent them herself on to the roads, and proposed that all of them, the 10,000 colliers of Montsou, should take stick and wallet like beggars of old, and scour the terrified country. The anguish continued to increase in the black room. The little urchins came back, hungry, they wanted to eat. Why could they not have something to eat? And they crumbled, flung themselves about, and at last trod on the feet of their dying sister, who groaned. The mother furiously boxed their ears in the darkness at random. Then, as they cried still louder, asking for bread, she burst into tears and dropped on to the floor, seizing them in one embrace with the little invalid. Then, for a long time, her tears fell in a nervous outbreak which left her limp and worn out, stammering over and over again the same phrase, calling for death. "Oh God, why do you not take us? Oh God, in pity take us, to have done with it!" The grandfather preserved his immobility, like an old tree twisted by the rain and wind, while the father continued walking between the fireplace and the cupboard, without turning his head. But the door opened, and this time it was Dr. Vanderhaghen. "The devil!" he said. "This light won't spoil your eyes. Look sharp, I'm in a hurry." As usual, he scolded, knocked up by work. Fortunately he had matches with him, and the father had to strike 6, one by one, and hold them while he examined the invalid. Unwound from her coverlet, she shivered beneath this flickering light, as lean as a bird. dying in the snow, so small that one only saw her hump. But she smiled with the wandering smile of the dying, and her eyes were very large, while her poor hands contracted over her hollow breast. And as the half choked mother asked if it was right to take away from her the only child who helped in the household, so intelligent and gentle, the doctor grew vexed. Ah, she is going, dead of hunger, your blessed child, and not the only one either. I've just seen another one over there. You all send for me, but I can't do anything. It's meat that you want to cure you." Maheu, with burnt fingers, had dropped the match, and the darkness closed over the little corpse, which was still warm. The doctor had gone away in a hurry. Étienne heard nothing more in the black room but Maheu's sobs, repeating her cry for death, that melancholy and endless lamentation. "Oh God! It is my turn! Take me! Oh God! Take my man! Take the others, out of pity, to have done with it!" Section 32 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by McElroy. Part 6, Chapter 3. On that Sunday, ever since 8 o'clock, Souvarine had been sitting alone in the parlour of the Advantage, at his accustomed place, with his head against the wall. Not a single collier knew where to get 2 sous for drink, and never had the bars had fewer customers. So Madame Rasseneur, motionless at the counter, preserved an irritated silence, while Rasseneur, standing before the iron fireplace, seemed to be gazing with a reflective air at the brown smoke from the coal. Suddenly, in this heavy silence of an overheated room, 3 light, quick blows, struck against one of the window panes, made Souvarine turn his head. He rose, for he recognized the signal which Étienne had already used several times before, in order to call him when he saw him from without, smoking his cigarette at an empty table. But before the engine man could reach the door, Rasseneur had opened it, and recognizing the man who stood there in the light from the window, he said to him: "Are you afraid that I shall sell you? You can talk better here than on the road." Étienne entered. Madame Rasseneur politely offered him a glass, which he refused, with a gesture. The innkeeper added: "I guessed long ago where you hide yourself. If I was a spy, as your friends say, I should have sent the police after you a week ago." "There is no need for you to defend yourself," replied the young man. "I know that you have never eaten that sort of bread. People may have different ideas and esteem each other all the same." And there was silence once more. Souvarine had gone back to his chair, with his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the smoke from his cigarette. But his feverish fingers were moving restlessly, and he ran them over his knees, seeking the warm fur of Poland, who was absent this evening. It was an unconscious discomfort, something that was lacking, he could not exactly say what. Seated on the other side of the table, Étienne at last said: "Tomorrow work begins again at the Voreux. The Belgians have come with little Négrel." "Yes, they landed them at nightfall," muttered Rasseneur, who remained standing. "As long as they don't kill each other after all." Then, raising his voice: "No, you know, I don't want to begin our disputes over again. But this will end badly if you hold out any longer. Why, your story is just like that of your International. I met Pluchart the day before yesterday at Lille, where I went on business. It's going wrong, that machine of his." He gave details. The association, after having conquered the workers of the whole world, in an outburst of propaganda which had left the middle class still shuddering, was now being devoured and slowly destroyed by an internal struggle between vanities and ambitions. Since the anarchists had triumphed in it, chasing out the earlier evolutionists, everything was breaking up. The original aim, the reform of the wage system, was lost in the midst of the squabbling of sects. The scientific framework was disorganized by the hatred of discipline. and already it was possible to foresee the final miscarriage of this general revolt which for a moment had threatened to carry away in a breath the old rotten society. "Pluchart is ill over it," Rasseneur went on, "and he has no voice at all now. All the same, he talks on in spite of everything and wants to go to Paris. And he told me 3 times over that our strike was done for." Étienne, with his eyes on the ground, let him talk on without interruption. The evening before he had chatted with some mates, and he felt that breaths of spite and suspicion were passing over him, those first breaths of unpopularity which forerun defeat. And he remained gloomy, he would not confess dejection, in the presence of a man who had foretold to him that the crowd would hoot him in his turn on the day when they had to avenge themselves for a miscalculation. "No doubt the strike is done for. I know that as well as Pluchart," he said. "But we foresaw that. We accepted this strike against our wishes, we didn't count on finishing up with the Company. Only one gets carried away, and one begins to expect things, and when it turns out badly one forgets that one ought to have expected that, instead of lamenting and quarrelling as if it were a catastrophe tumbled down from heaven." "Then if you think the game's lost," asked Rasseneur, "why don't you make the mates listen to reason?" The young man looked at him fixedly. "Listen, enough of this. You have your ideas, I have mine. I came in here to show you that I feel esteem for you in spite of everything. But I still think that if we come to grief over this trouble, our starved carcasses will do more for the people's cause than all your common sense politics. Ah! if one of those bloody soldiers would just put a bullet in my heart, that would be a fine way of ending." His eyes were moist, as in this cry there broke out the secret desire of the vanquished, the refuge in which he desired to lose his torment for ever. "Well said!" declared Madame Rasseneur, casting on her husband a look which was full of all the contempt of radical opinions. Souvarine, with a vague gaze, feeling about with his nervous hands, did not appear to hear. His fair girlish face, with the thin nose and small pointed teeth, seemed to be growing savage in some mystic dream full of bloody visions. And he began to dream aloud, replying to a remark of Rasseneur's about the International, which had been let fall in the course of the conversation. "They are all cowards. There is only one man who can make their machine into a terrible instrument of destruction. It requires will, and none of them have will, and that's why the revolution will miscarry once more." He went on in a voice of disgust, lamenting the imbecility of men, while the other two were disturbed by these somnambulistic confidences made in the darkness. In Russia there was nothing going on well, and he was in despair over the news he had received. His old companions were all turning to the politicians, the famous nihilists who made Europe tremble, sons of village priests, of the lower middle class, of tradesmen, could not rise above the idea of national liberation, and seemed to believe that the world would be delivered when they had killed their despot. As soon as he spoke to them of razing society to the ground like a ripe harvest, as soon as he even pronounced the infantile word republic, he felt that he was misunderstood and a disturber, henceforth unclassed, enrolled among the lost leaders of cosmopolitan revolution. His patriotic heart struggled, however, and it was with painful bitterness that he repeated his favourite expression: "Foolery! They'll never get out of it with their foolery." Then, lowering his voice still more, in a few bitter words he described his old dream of fraternity. He had renounced his rank and his fortune, he had gone among workmen only in the hope of seeing at last the foundation of a new society of labour in common. All the sous in his pockets had long gone to the urchins of the settlement. He had been as tender as a brother with the colliers, smiling at their suspicion, winning them over by his quiet workman-like ways, and his dislike of chattering. But decidedly the fusion had not taken place. He remained a stranger, with his contempt of all bonds, his desire to keep himself free of all petty vanities and enjoyments. And since this morning he had been especially exasperated by reading an incident in the newspapers. His voice changed, his eyes grew bright. He fixed them on Étienne, directly addressing him. "Now, do you understand that? These hat workers at Marseilles, who have won the great lottery prize of 100,000 francs, have gone off at once and invested it, declaring that they are going to live without doing anything. Yes, that is your idea, all of you French workmen. You want to unearth a treasure in order to devour it alone afterwards in some lazy, selfish corner. You may cry out as much as you like against the rich, you haven't got courage enough to give back to the poor the money that luck brings you. You will never be worthy of happiness as long as you own anything, and your hatred of the bourgeois proceeds solely from an angry desire to be bourgeois yourselves in their place." Rasseneur burst out laughing. The idea that the two Marseilles workmen ought to renounce the big prize seemed to him absurd, but Souvarine grew pale, his face changed and became terrible in one of those religious rages which exterminate nations. He cried: "You will all be mown down, overthrown, cast on the dung heap. Someone will be born who will annihilate your race of cowards and pleasure seekers. And look here, you see my hands. If my hands were able they would take up the earth, like that, and shake it until it was smashed to fragments, and you were all buried beneath the rubbish." "Well said!" declared Madame Rasseneur, with her polite and convinced air. There was silence again. Then Étienne spoke once more of the Borinage men. He questioned Souvarine concerning the steps that had been taken at the Voreux. But the engine man was still preoccupied, and scarcely replied. He only knew that cartridges would be distributed to the soldiers who were guarding the pit, and the nervous restlessness of his fingers over his knees increased to such an extent that, at last, he became conscious of what was lacking, the soft and soothing fur of the tame rabbit. "Where is Poland, then?" he asked. The innkeeper laughed again as he looked at his wife. After an awkward silence, he made up his mind. "Poland? She is in the pot." Since her adventure with Jeanlin, the pregnant rabbit, no doubt wounded, had only brought forth dead young ones, and to avoid feeding a useless mouth they had resigned themselves that very day to serve her up with potatoes. "Yes, you ate one of her legs this evening. Eh, you licked your fingers after it." Souvarine had not understood at first. Then he became very pale, and his face contracted with nausea, while, in spite of his stoicism, two large tears were swelling beneath his eyelids. But no one had time to notice this emotion, for the door had opened roughly and Chaval had appeared, pushing Catherine before him. After having made himself drunk with beer and bluster in all the public houses of Montsou, the idea had occurred to him to go to the Avantage to show his old friends that he was not afraid. As he came in, he said to his mistress: "By God, I tell you, you shall drink a glass in here. I'll break the jaws of the first man who looks askance at me." Catherine, moved at the sight of Étienne, had become very pale. When Chaval in his turn perceived him, he grinned in his evil fashion. "Two glasses, Madame Rasseneur. We're wetting the new start of work." Without a word she poured out, as a woman who never refused her beer to anyone. There was silence, and neither the landlord nor the two others stirred from their places. "I know people who said that I was a spy," Chaval went on, swaggeringly, "and I'm waiting for them just to say it again to my face, so that we can have a bit of explanation." No one replied, and the men turned their heads and gazed vaguely at the walls. "There are some who sham, and there are some who don't sham," he went on louder. "I've nothing to hide. I've left Deneulin's dirty shop, and tomorrow I'm going down to the Voreux with a dozen Belgians, who have been given me to lead, because I'm held in esteem, and if any one doesn't like that, he can just say so, and we'll talk it over." Then, as the same contemptuous silence greeted his provocations, he turned furiously on Catherine. "Will you drink, by God? Drink with me to the confusion of all the dirty beasts who refuse to work." She drank, but with so trembling a hand that the two glasses struck together with a tinkling sound. He had now pulled out of his pocket a handful of silver, which he exhibited with drunken ostentation, saying that he had earned that with his sweat, and that he defied the shammers to show 10 sous. The attitude of his mates exasperated him, and he began to come to direct insults. "Then it is at night that the moles come out? The police have to go to sleep before we meet the brigands." Étienne had risen, very calm and resolute. "Listen, you annoy me. Yes, you are a spy. Your money still stinks of some treachery. You've sold yourself, and it disgusts me to touch your skin. No matter, I'm your man. It is quite time that one of us did for the other." Chaval clenched his fists. "Come along then, cowardly dog! I must call you so to warm you up. You all alone. I'm quite willing. And you shall pay for all the bloody tricks that have been played on me." With suppliant arms Catherine advanced between them, but they had no need to repel her. She felt the necessity of the battle, and slowly drew back of her own accord. Standing against the wall, she remained silent, so paralysed with anguish that she no longer shivered, her large eyes gazing at these two men who were going to kill each other over her. Madame Rasseneur simply removed the glasses from the counter for fear that they might be broken. Then she sat down again on the bench, without showing any improper curiosity. But two old mates could not be left to murder each other like this. Rasseneur persisted in interfering, and Souvarine had to take him by the shoulder and lead him back to the table, saying: "It doesn't concern you. There is one of them too many, and the strongest must live." Without waiting for the attack, Chaval's fists were already dealing blows at space. He was the taller of the two, and his blows swung about aiming at the face, with furious cutting movements of both arms, one after the other, as though he were handling a couple of sabres. And he went on talking, playing to the gallery with volleys of abuse which served to excite him. "Ah, you damned devil! I'll have your nose! I'll do for your bloody nose! Just let me get at your chops, you whore's looking glass! I'll make a hash for the bloody swine, and then we shall see if the strumpets will run after you." In silence and with clenched teeth, Étienne gathered up his small figure, according to the rules of the game, protecting his chest and face by both fists, and he watched and let them fly like springs released, with terrible straight blows. At first they did each other little damage. The whirling and blustering blows of the one, the cool watchfulness of the other, prolonged the struggle. A chair was overthrown, their heavy boots crushed the white sand scattered on the floor. But at last they were out of breath, their panting respiration was heard, while their faces became red and swollen as from an interior fire which flamed out from the clear holes of their eyes. "Played!" yelled Chaval. "Trumps on your carcass!" In fact, his fist, working like a flail, had struck his adversary's shoulder. Étienne restrained a groan of pain, and the only sound that was heard was the dull bruising of the muscles. Étienne replied with a straight blow to Chaval's chest, which would have knocked him out, had he had not saved himself by one of his constant goat-like leaps. The blow, however, caught him on the left flank with such effect that he tottered, momentarily winded. He became furious on feeling his arm grow limp with pain, and kicked out like a wild beast, aiming at his adversary's belly with his heel. "Have at your guts!" he stammered in a choked voice. "I'll pull them out and unwind them for you." Étienne avoided the blow, so indignant at this infraction of the laws of fair fighting that he broke silence. "Hold your tongue, brute! And no feet, by God, or I'd take a chair and bash you with it." Then the struggle became serious. Rasseneur was disgusted and would again have interfered, but a severe look from his wife held him back. Had not two customers a right to settle an affair in the house? He simply placed himself before the fireplace, for fear lest they should tumble over into it. Souvarine, in his quiet way, had rolled a cigarette, but he forgot to light it. Catherine was motionless against the wall, only her hands had unconsciously risen to her waist, and with constant fidgeting movements were twisting and tearing at the stuff of her dress. She was striving as hard as possible not to cry out, and so, perhaps, kill one of them by declaring her preference, but she was, too, so distracted that she did not even know which she preferred. Chaval, who was bathed in sweat and striking at random, soon became exhausted. In spite of his anger, Étienne continued to cover himself, parrying nearly all the blows, a few of which grazed him. His ear was split, a finger nail had torn away a piece of his neck, and this so smarted that he swore in his turn as he drove out one of his terrible straight blows. Once more Chaval saved his chest by a leap, but he had lowered himself, and the fist reached his face, smashing his nose and crushing one eye. Immediately a jet of blood came from his nostrils, and his eye became swollen and bluish. Blinded by this red flood, and dazed by the shock to his skull, the wretch was beating the air with his arms at random, when another blow, striking him at last full in the chest, finished him. There was a crunching sound. He fell on his back with a heavy thud, as when a sack of plaster is emptied. Étienne waited. "Get up. If you want some more, we'll begin again." Without replying, Chaval, after a few minutes' stupefaction, moved on the ground and stretched his limbs. He picked himself up with difficulty, resting for a moment, curled up on his knees, doing something with his hand in the bottom of his pocket which could not be observed. Then, when he was up, he rushed forward again, his throat swelling with a savage yell. But Catherine had seen, and in spite of herself a loud cry came from her heart, astonishing her like the avowal of a preference she had herself been ignorant of. "Take care, he's got his knife!" Étienne had only time to parry the first blow with his arm. His woollen jacket was cut by the thick blade, one of those blades fastened by a copper ferrule into a boxwood handle. He had already seized Chaval's wrist, and a terrible struggle began, for he felt that he would be lost if he let go, while the other shook his arm in the effort to free it and strike. The weapon was gradually lowered as their stiffened limbs grew fatigued. Étienne twice felt the cold sensation of steel against his skin, and he had to make a supreme effort, so crushing the other's wrist that the knife slipped from his hand. Both of them had fallen to the earth, and it was Étienne who snatched it up, brandishing it in his turn. He held Chaval down beneath his knee and threatened to slit his throat open. "Ah, traitor! By God! you've got it coming to you now!" He felt an awful voice within, deafening him. It arose from his bowels and was beating in his head like a hammer. A sudden mania of murder, a need to taste blood. Never before had the crisis so shaken him. He was not drunk, however, and he struggled against the hereditary disease with the despairing shudder of a man who is mad with lust and struggles on the verge of rape. At last he conquered himself. He threw the knife behind him, stammering in a hoarse voice: "Get up! Off you go!" This time Rasseneur had rushed forward, but without quite daring to venture between them, for fear of catching a nasty blow. He did not want any one to be murdered in his house, and was so angry that his wife, sitting erect at the counter, remarked to him that he always cried out too soon. Souvarine, who had nearly caught the knife in his legs, decided to light his cigarette. Was it, then, all over? Catherine was looking on stupidly at the two men, who were unexpectedly both living. "Off you go!" repeated Étienne. "Off you go, or I'll do for you!" Chaval arose, and with the back of his hand wiped away the blood which continued to flow from his nose. With jaw smeared red and bruised eye, he went away trailing his feet, furious at his defeat. Catherine mechanically followed him. Then he turned round and his hatred broke out in a flood of filth. "No, no! Since you want him, sleep with him, dirty jade, and don't put your bloody feet in my place again if you value your skin!" He violently banged the door. There was deep silence in the warm room. The low crackling of the coal was alone heard. On the ground there only remained the overturned chair and a rain of blood which the sand on the floor was drinking up. Section 33 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Ferrard. Part 6, Chapter 4. When they came out of Rasseneur's, Étienne and Catherine walked on in silence. The thaw was beginning, a slow, cold thaw which stained the snow without melting it. In the livid sky a full moon could be faintly seen behind great clouds, black rags driven furiously by a tempestuous wind far above; and on the earth no breath was stirring, nothing could be heard but drippings from the roofs, the falling of white lumps with a soft thud. Étienne was embarrassed by this woman who had been given to him, and in his disquiet he could find nothing to say. The idea of taking her with him to hide at Réquillart seemed absurd. He had proposed to lead her back to the settlement, to her parents' house, but she had refused in terror. No, no; anything rather than be a burden on them once more after having behaved so badly to them. And neither of them spoke any more. They tramped on at random through the roads which were becoming rivers of mud. At first they went down towards the Voreux, then they turned to the right and passed between the pit bank and the canal. "But you'll have to sleep somewhere," he said at last. "Now, if I only had a room, I could easily take you." But a curious spasm of timidity interrupted him. The past came back to him, their old longings for each other, and the delicacies and the shames which had prevented them from coming together. Did he still desire her, that he felt so troubled, gradually warmed at the heart by a fresh longing? The recollection of the blows she had dealt him at Gaston Marie now attracted him instead of filling him with spite. And he was surprised. The idea of taking her to Réquillart was becoming quite natural and easy to execute. "Now, come, decide. Where would you like me to take you? You must hate me very much to refuse to come with me." She was following him slowly, delayed by the painful slipping of her sabots into the ruts, and without raising her head she murmured: "I have enough trouble. Good God! Don't give me any more. What good would it do us? What you ask, now that I have a lover, and you have a woman yourself?" She meant Mouquette. She believed that he still went with this girl, as the rumour ran for the last fortnight; and when he swore to her that it was not so, she shook her head, for she remembered the evening when she had seen them eagerly kissing each other. "Isn't it a pity, all this nonsense?" he whispered, stopping. "We might understand each other so well." She shuddered slightly, and replied: "Never mind. You've nothing to be sorry for. You don't lose much. If you knew what a trumpery thing I am, no bigger than two ha'porth of butter, so ill made that I shall never become a woman, sure enough." And she went on freely accusing herself, as though the long delay of her puberty had been her own fault. In spite of the man whom she had had, this lessened her, placed her among the urchins. One has some excuse, at any rate, when one can produce a child. "My poor little one!" said Étienne, with deep pity, and a very low voice. They were at the foot of the pit bank, hidden in the shadow of the enormous pile. An inky cloud was just then passing over the moon. They could no longer even distinguish their faces, their breaths were mingled, their lips were seeking each other for that kiss which had tormented them with desire for months. But suddenly the moon reappeared, and they saw the sentinel above them, at the top of the rocks, white with light, standing out erect on the Voreux. And before they had kissed an emotion of modesty separated them, that old modesty in which there was something of anger, of vague repugnance, and much friendship. They set out again heavily, up to their ankles in mud. "Then it's settled. You don't want to have anything to do with me?" asked Étienne. "No," she said. "You after Chaval, and after you another, eh? No, that disgusts me. It doesn't give me any pleasure. What's the use of doing it?" They were silent, and walked some 100 paces without exchanging a word. "But, anyhow, do you know where to go to?" he said again. "I can't leave you out on a night like this." She replied simply: "I'm going back. Chaval is my man. I have nowhere else to sleep but with him." "But he will beat you to death." There was silence again. She had shrugged her shoulders in resignation. He would beat her, and when he was tired of beating her he would stop. Was not that better than to roam the streets like a vagabond? Then she was used to blows. She said, to console herself, that 8 out of 10 girls were no better off than she was. If her lover married her some day it would, all the same, be very nice of him. Étienne and Catherine were moving mechanically towards Montsou, and as they came near their silences grew longer. It was as though they had never before been together. He could find no argument to convince her, in spite of the deep vexation which he felt at seeing her go back to Chaval. His heart was breaking, he had nothing better to offer than an existence of wretchedness and flight, a night with no tomorrow should a soldier's bullet go through his head. Perhaps, after all, it was wiser to suffer what he was suffering rather than risk a fresh suffering. So he led her back to her lovers, with sunken head, and made no protest when she stopped him on the main road, at the corner of the yards, 20 metres from the Estaminet Piquette, saying: "Don't come any farther. If he sees you, it will only make things worse." 11 o'clock struck at the church. The Estaminet was closed, but gleams came through the cracks. "Good bye," she murmured. She had given him her hand. He kept it, and she had to draw it away painfully, with a slow effort, to leave him. Without turning her head, she went in through the little latched door. But he did not turn away, standing at the same place with his eyes on the house, anxious as to what was passing within. He listened, trembling lest he should hear the cries of a beaten woman. The house remained black and silent. He only saw a light appear at a first floor window, and as this window opened, and he recognized the thin shadow that was leaning over the road, he came near. Catherine then whispered very low: "He's not come back. I'm going to bed. Please go away." Étienne went off. The thaw was increasing. A regular shower was falling from the roofs. A moist sweat flowed down the walls, the palings, the whole confused mass of this industrial district, lost in night. At first he turned towards Réquillart, sick with fatigue and sadness, having no other desire except to disappear under the earth and to be annihilated there. Then the idea of the Voreux occurred to him again. He thought of the Belgian workmen who were going down, of his mates at the settlement, exasperated against the soldiers and resolved not to tolerate strangers in their pit. And he passed again along the canal through the puddles of melted snow. As he stood once more near the pit bank, the moon was shining brightly. He raised his eyes and gazed at the sky. The clouds were galloping by, whipped on by the strong wind which was blowing up there, but they were growing white, and ravelling out thinly with the misty transparency of troubled water over the moon's face. They succeeded each other so rapidly that the moon, veiled at moments, constantly reappeared in limpid clearness. With gaze full of his pure brightness, Étienne was lowering his head, when a spectacle on the summit of the pit bank attracted his attention. The sentinel, stiffened by cold, was walking up and down, taking 25 paces towards Marchiennes, and then returning towards Montsou. The white glitter of his bayonet could be seen above his black silhouette, which stood out clearly against the pale sky. But what interested the young man, behind the cabin where Bonnemort used to take shelter on tempestuous nights, was a moving shadow, a crouching beast in ambush, which he immediately recognized as Jeanlin, with his long, flexible spine like a marten's. The sentinel could not see him. That brigand of a child was certainly preparing some practical joke, for he was still furious against the soldiers, and asking when they were going to be freed from these murderers who had been sent here with guns to kill people. For a moment Étienne thought of calling him to prevent the execution of some stupid trick. The moon was hidden; he had seen him draw himself up, ready to spring. But the moon reappeared, and the child remained crouching. At every turn the sentinel came as far as the cabin, then turned his back and walked in the opposite direction. And suddenly, as a cloud threw its shadow, Jeanlin leapt on to the soldier's shoulders with the great bound of a wild cat, and gripping him with his claws, buried his large open knife in his throat. The horsehair collar resisted. He had to apply both hands to the handle and hang on with all the weight of his body. He had often bled fowls, which he had found behind farms. It was so rapid that there was only a stifled cry in the night, while the musket fell with the sound of an old iron. Already the moon was shining again. Motionless with stupor, Étienne was still gazing. A shout had been choked in his chest. Above, the pit bank was vacant. No shadow was any longer visible against the wild flight of clouds. He ran up and found Jeanlin on all fours before the corpse, which was lying back with extended arms. Beneath the limpid light the red trousers and grey overcoat contrasted harshly with the snow. Not a drop of blood had flowed. The knife was still in the throat, up to the handle. With a furious, unreasoning blow of the fist, he knocked the child down beside the body. "What have you done that for?" he stammered wildly. Jeanlin picked himself up and rested on his hands with a feline movement of his thin spine. His large ears, his green eyes, his prominent jaws were quivering and aflame with the shock of his deadly blow. "By God! Why have you done this?" "I don't know. I wanted to." He persisted in this reply. For 3 days he had wanted to. It tormented him, it made his head ache behind his ears, because he thought about it so much. Need one be so particular with these damned soldiers who were worrying the colliers in their own homes? Of the violent speeches he had heard in the forest, the cries of destruction and death shouted among the pits, 5 or 6 words had remained with him, and these he repeated like a street urchin playing at revolution. And he knew no more. No one had urged him on. It had come to him of itself, just as the desire to steal onions from a field came to him. Startled at this obscure growth of crime in the recesses of this childish brain, Étienne again pushed him away with a kick, like an unconscious animal. He trembled lest the guard at the Voreux had heard the sentinel's stifled cry, and looked towards the pit every time the moon was uncovered. But nothing stirred, and he bent down, felt the hands that were gradually becoming icy, and listened to the heart, which had stopped beneath the overcoat. Only the bone handle of the knife could be seen, with the motto on it, the simple word "Amour," engraved in black letters. His eyes went from the throat to the face. Suddenly he recognized the little soldier. It was Jules, the recruit with whom he had talked one morning. And deep pity came over him in front of this fair, gentle face, marked with freckles. The blue eyes, wide open, were gazing at the sky with that fixed gaze with which he had before seen him, searching the horizon for the country of his birth. Where was it, that Plogof, which had appeared to him beneath the dazzling sun? Over there, over there. The sea was moaning afar on this tempestuous night. That wind passing above had perhaps swept over the moors. 2 women, perhaps, were standing there, the mother and the sister, clutching their wind-blown coifs, gazing as if they could see what was now happening to the little fellow through the leagues which separated them. They would always wait for him now. What an abominable thing it is for poor devils to kill each other for the sake of the rich! But this corpse had to be disposed of. Étienne at first thought of throwing it into the canal, but was deterred from this by the certainty that it would be found there. His anxiety became extreme. Every minute was of importance. What decision should he take? He had a sudden inspiration. If he could carry the body as far as Réquillart, he would be able to bury it there for ever. "Come here," he said to Jeanlin. The child was suspicious. "No, you want to beat me, and then I have business. Good night." In fact, he had given a rendezvous to Bébert and Lydie in a hiding place, a hole arranged under the wood supply at the below. It had been arranged to sleep out, so as to be there if the Belgians' bones were to be broken by stoning when they went down the pit. "Listen," repeated Étienne. "Come here, or I shall call the soldiers, who will cut your head off." And as Jeanlin was making up his mind, he rolled his handkerchief and bound the soldier's neck tightly, without drawing out the knife, so as to prevent the blood from flowing. The snow was melting. On the soil there was neither a red patch nor the footmarks of a struggle. "Take the legs." Jeanlin took the legs, while Étienne seized the shoulders, after having fastened the gun behind his back, and then they both slowly descended the pit bank, trying to avoid rolling any rocks down. Fortunately the moon was hidden. But as they passed along the canal it reappeared brightly, and it was a miracle that the guard did not see them. Silently they hastened on, hindered by the swinging of the corpse, and obliged to place it on the ground every 100 metres. At the corner of the Réquillart lane they heard a sound which froze them with terror, and they only had time to hide behind a wall to avoid a patrol. Farther on a man came across them, but he was drunk, and moved away abusing them. At last they reached the old pit, bathed in perspiration, and so exhausted that their teeth were chattering. Étienne had guessed that it would not be easy to get the soldier down the ladder shaft. It was an awful task. First of all, Jeanlin, standing above, had to let the body slide down, while Étienne, hanging on to the bushes, had to accompany it to enable it to pass the first two ladders where the rungs were broken. Afterwards, at every ladder, he had to perform the same manoeuvre over again, going down first, then receiving the body in his arms. And he had thus, down 30 ladders, 210 metres, to feel it constantly falling over him. The gun scraped his spine. He had not allowed the child to go for the candle end, which she preserved avariciously. What was the use? The light would only embarrass them in this narrow tube. When they arrived at the pit eye, however, out of breath, he sent the youngster for the candle. He then sat down and waited for him in the darkness, near the body, with heart beating violently. As soon as Jeanlin reappeared with the light, Étienne consulted with him, for the child had explored these old workings, even to the cracks through which men could not pass. They set out again, dragging the dead body for nearly a kilometre, through a maze of ruinous galleries. At last the roof became low, and they found themselves kneeling beneath a sandy rock supported by half-broken planks. It was a sort of long chest in which they laid the little soldier as in a coffin. They placed his gun by his side. Then with vigorous blows of their heels they broke the timber at the risk of being buried themselves. Immediately the rock gave way, and they scarcely had time to crawl back on their elbows and knees. When Étienne returned, seized by the desire to look once more, the roof was still falling in, slowly crushing the body beneath its enormous weight. And then there was nothing more left, nothing but the vast mass of the earth. Jeanlin, having returned to his own corner, his little cavern of villainy, was stretching himself out on the hay, overcome by weariness, and murmuring: "Heigh ho! The brats must wait for me. I'm going to have an hour's sleep." Étienne had blown out the candle, of which there was only a small end left. He also was worn out, but he was not sleepy. Painful nightmare thoughts were beating like hammers in his skull. Only one at last remained, torturing him and fatiguing him with a question to which he could not reply. Why had he not struck Chaval when he held him beneath the knife? And why had this child just killed a soldier whose very name he did not know? It shook his revolutionary beliefs, the courage to kill, the right to kill. Was he, then, a coward? In the hay the child had begun snoring, the snoring of a drunken man, as if he were sleeping off the intoxication of his murder. Étienne was disgusted and irritated. It hurt him to know that the boy was there and to hear him. Suddenly he started, a breath of fear passed over his face, a light rustling, a sob, seemed to him to have come out of the depths of the earth. The image of the little soldier, lying over there with his gun beneath the rocks, froze his back and made his hair stand up. It was idiotic. The whole mind seemed to be filled with voices. He had to light the candle again, and only grew calm on seeing the emptiness of the galleries by this pale light. For another quarter of an hour he reflected, still absorbed in the same struggle, his eyes fixed on the burning wick. But there was a spluttering. The wick was going out, and everything fell back into darkness. He shuddered again. He could have boxed Jeanlin's ears to keep him from snoring so loudly. The neighbourhood of the child became so unbearable that he escaped, tormented by the need for fresh air, hastening through the galleries and up the passage as though he could hear a shadow panting at his heels. Up above, in the midst of the ruins of Réquillart, Étienne was at last able to breathe freely. Since he dared not kill, it was for him to die. And this idea of death, which had already touched him, came again and fixed itself in his head, as a last hope. To die bravely, to die for the revolution, that would end everything, would settle his account, good or bad, and prevent him from thinking more. If the men attacked the Borains, he would be in the first rank, and would have a good chance of getting a bad blow. It was with firmer step that he returned to prowl around the Voreux. 2 o'clock struck, and the loud noise of voices was coming from the captain's room, where the guards who watched over the pit were posted. The disappearance of the sentinel had overcome the guards with surprise. They had gone to arouse the captain, and after a careful examination of the place, they concluded that it must be a case of desertion. Hiding in the shade, Étienne recollected this republican captain of whom the little soldier had spoken. Who knows if he might not be persuaded to pass over to the people's side? The troop would raise their rifles, and that would be the signal for a massacre of the bourgeois. A new dream took possession of him. He thought no more of dying, but remained for hours with his feet in the mud and a drizzle from the thaw falling on his shoulders, filled by the feverish hope that victory was still possible. Up to 5 o'clock he watched for the Borains. Then he perceived that the Company had cunningly arranged that they should sleep at the Voreux. The descent had begun, and the few strikers from the Deux Cent Quarante settlement, who had been posted as scouts, had not yet warned their mates. It was he who told them of the trick, and they set out running, while he waited behind the pit bank on the towing path. 6 o'clock struck, and the earthy sky was growing pale and lighting up with a reddish dawn, when the Abbé Ranvier came along the path, holding up his cassock above his thin legs. Every Monday he went to say an early mass at a convent chapel on the other side of the pit. "Good morning, my friend," he shouted in a loud voice, after staring at the young man with his flaming eyes. But Étienne did not reply. Far away between the Voreux platforms he had just seen a woman pass, and he rushed forward anxiously, for he thought he recognized Catherine. Since midnight Catherine had been walking about the thawing roads. Chaval, on coming back and finding her in bed, had knocked her out with a blow. He shouted to her to go at once by the door, if she did not wish to go by the window, and scarcely dressed, in tears, and bruised by kicks in her legs, she had been obliged to go down, pushed outside by a final thrust. This sudden separation dazed her, and she sat down on a stone, looking up at the house, still expecting that he would call her back. It was not possible. He would surely look for her, and tell her to come back when he saw her thus shivering and abandoned, with no one to take her in. At the end of 2 hours she made up her mind, dying of cold and as motionless as a dog thrown into the street. She left Montsou, then retraced her steps, but dared neither to call from the pathway nor to knock at the door. At last she went off by the main road to the right, with the idea of going to the settlement, to her parents' house. But when she reached it she was seized by such shame that she rushed away along the gardens, for fear of being recognized by someone, in spite of the heavy sleep which weighed on all eyes behind the closed shutters. And after that she wandered about, frightened at the slightest noise, trembling lest she should be seized, and led away as a strumpet to that house at Marchiennes, the threat of which had haunted her like nightmare for months. Twice she stumbled against the Voreux, but, terrified at the loud voices of the guard, she ran away out of breath, looking behind her to see if she was being pursued. The Réquillart lane was always full of drunken men. She went back to it, however, with the vague hope of meeting there him she had repelled a few hours earlier. Chaval had to go down that morning, and this thought brought Catherine again towards the pit, though she felt that it would be useless to speak to him. All was over between them. There was no work going on at Jean Bart, and he had sworn to kill her if she worked again at the Voreux, where he feared that she would compromise him. So what was to be done? To go elsewhere, to die of hunger, to yield beneath the blows of every man who might pass? She dragged herself along, tottering amid the ruts, with aching legs and mud up to her spine. The thaw had now filled the streets with a flood of mire. She waded through it, still walking, not daring to look for a stone to sit on. Day appeared. Catherine had just recognized the back of Chaval, who was cautiously going round the pit bank, when she noticed Lydie and Bébert putting their noses out of their hiding place beneath the wood supply. They had passed the night there in ambush, without going home, since Jeanlin's order was to await him, and while this latter was sleeping off the drunkenness of his murder at Réquillart, the two children were lying in each other's arms to keep warm. The wind blew between the planks of chestnut and oak, and they rolled themselves up as in some woodcutter's abandoned hut. Lydie did not dare to speak aloud the sufferings of the small beaten woman, any more than Bébert found courage to complain of the captain's blows, which made his cheeks swell. But the captain was really abusing his power, risking their bones in mad marauding expeditions while refusing to share the booty. Their hearts rose in revolt, and they had at last embraced each other in spite of his orders, careless of that box of the ears from the invisible with which he had threatened them. It never came, so they went on kissing each other softly, with no idea of anything else, putting into that caress the passion they had long struggled against, the whole of their martyred and tender natures. All night through they had thus kept each other warm, so happy, at the bottom of this secret hole, that they could not remember that they had ever been so happy before, not even on St. Barbara's Day, when they had eaten fritters and drunk wine. The sudden sound of a bugle made Catherine start. She raised herself, and saw the Voreux guards taking up their arms. Étienne arrived, running. Bébert and Lydie jumped out of their hiding place with a leap, and over there, beneath the growing daylight, a band of men and women were coming from the settlement, gesticulating wildly with anger. Section 34